So there's a gang, a notorious burglary gang we're going to talk about, and one of the leaders of which is a guy called Edward Wall. The gang are known as the Cockwalls, and they have been prolific as travelling around the country, robbing anything, and many of them have a number of convictions. Edward is currently in jail, serving a sentence, but the Criminal Assets Bureau affidavit shows us that he has actually been assessed for a huge tax bill by them.
Yeah, at one point they were assessed that he owed 3 million in tax. It's going back a couple of years, and again it was part of a recent case that was finished up. It was, they had seized these cars and they'd wait the 7 years. And then the money from the sale of those cars was now being declared the proceeds of crime. But there was the original affidavits, like we're talking about, what the gang were at. And Edward Wall was considered the leader of this particular gang. And there was instance of some of the stuff they got up to, in terms of these kind of prolific level of burglaries where they'll go out and they'll do multiple burglaries, 4 or 5 of them working together, maybe in 2 cars. They have no problem going into at high speeds to get away from guards. They're quite reckless. They know exactly what they're doing. They're very professional. They're in and out of properties within a short space of time. And they're looking for anything that can be sold, basically gold and cash and stuff like that. And they were also involved in kind of ram raids to stealing cigarettes. And they would have been part of the kind of the wider group that I suppose Fat Andy Connors would have been considered kind of the leader, or certainly the most successful, who would have been related on one side. He would have been related to this crew called the Cockwalls, and the Cockwall organised crime gang is a designation given to them by the guards as well. There'd be a number of brothers of Edward who'd have been involved in serious crime as well.
So this €3 million bill, it's interesting, and if we look at the detail, it appears to have been an assessment taken from bank accounts he was using prior to 2004. So when the Criminal Assets Bureau was set up in 96, a lot of those earlier cases you see, including that against the monk, are essentially revenue cases. They're tax assessments. So they look at what's gone through their accounts. They consider that, it's money that they can't account for. So they then calculate what taxes and fines, etc., they should owe from a period of time, from money they can see. I think more recently, and probably really from the early, as a few of those cases went through the courts and proved pretty difficult to get that money, especially from criminals. If you or I got a tax bill for 3 million, you'd be rolling around the bed and selling up everything to try and pay it. Or you'd be doing a deal as regards how much you needed to pay a month. But when you're dealing with criminals who don't have sort of an income in the first place, they end up with these tax assessments and they just carry on regardless. The 3 million is unlikely to have been paid or to ever be paid unless Mr. Wall attempts to sell any legitimate assets that he may have, and if the state are aware of them, they may have a lien on a mortgage. So if a property is sold, they will get their dues before he gets anything. But it was kind of like the old-fashioned way the Criminal Assets Bureau used to operate. So these tax bills just sit there. Now, some of the criminals did pay off their tax bills, and in recent times we spoke to Jerry Hutch here on the podcast in relation to his own tax assessment, which he paid off, but it actually gave him a clean bill of health then, if you did pay it. It's complex a little bit, isn't it?
Yeah, and the way it was done, I suppose, now it's very much focusing on the assets and the cash, and the assets can be a house, and then even the idea if somebody puts added value in the house, or the house might originally have been bought with legitimate assets, but if you put $500,000 in it, they'll say, well, we're taking this house off you and we're going to sell it and we're going to keep the money apart from the legitimate part that was originally done. And that's the way some of these cases have been going. We've seen that where people have got back a proportion of the final sale of the house or property.
Yeah.
And that's been done in a couple of cases. But
it's probably just makes more efficiency, more sense to be able to identify an asset, be it a house, a racehorse, a car, an item of expensive jewellery, designer handbags, whatever it is. Focus on that, and for the cab to lay out their case that this person didn't have legitimate income to be able to afford to buy it. The person can come back with their defence or whatever, but ultimately you have something solid in front of you that the state will often, in many cases, sort of win. Whereas these tax bills, you know, if you have a guy like Edward Wall, and we're going to go back over his background a little bit, who is going around the country robbing things, nothing ever goes into the legitimate economy here.
No, and I mean... And
it's interesting he stops using bank accounts in 2004.
Yeah. It was fairly early on, all right, in that sense.
On at that stage, didn't they?
Yeah, but even the fact that, I mean, it may look like a small enough thing that it was just over 2 different cars between himself and his son, but they linked him to 20 different cars, and then they would use various different means of, like using a false name with the right address, getting someone else to allow their address to be used to register a car, getting other people to register address using fictitious names, all of this kind of thing. And then cars would be sold and moved on a regular basis.
And they're very much used as currency within the criminal underworld.
Yeah, and it was very much to kind of create this like big long chain of fake owners.
Yeah.
But they you know, the Criminal Access Bureau went through them all one by one and interviewed people, and you know, when we were able to track down, look, there's money sloshing around here. There was an initial amount of cash that was used by people who have no legitimate income whatsoever. And you know, we're able to kind of buy and sell cars on a regular basis.
So Edward Wall was one of the leaders of this notorious burglary gang that has really been the subject of, is it Operation Thor?
Operation Thor and Operation Fiacla. And there's another one, Operation Erebus, which I only heard about recently, which was targeting another gang. But yeah, so I mean, this has been a kind of a huge surveillance operation that was put in, the Garda helicopter, and I'm sure there was other, like kind of the National Surveillance Unit, I'm sure were involved in kind of trying to keep track of some of these people, trying to figure out what car they might use, so that they were trying to get ahead of them, because I think the view was they needed to catch them in the act, which they have done on a couple of occasions. Like, he's currently serving a 4.5-year sentence. It was a robbery of just under 20 grand's worth of jewellery.
Was that from a private home?
Yeah, it was a private home in Killiney, February 2021, and there was 2 elderly people, like in 83 and 79, and they didn't even know they were being robbed. They were oblivious to what was going on.
They were probably better off.
Yeah, well, that's it. And I mean, like, you know, and it looks like they were on surveillance. They've been spotted on the M50, and they'd been seen kind of taking anti-surveillance precautions. You know, obviously these things of going off at a ramp at the last second and going around roundabouts a couple of times and doubling back and stopping and waiting and going again and doubling back and all this kind of stuff, like, you know. So, I mean, it's fairly obvious if somebody is trying to see if they're being followed at a basic level, I suppose. But I mean, if you have the National Surveillance Unit or you know, the helicopter up, I mean, the helicopter can follow you from several kilometres away. You don't even know it's in the sky. So, I mean, there are... But, you know, that means it's a resource-heavy operation. I
was going to say that,
so,
absolutely.
I mean, they really are, they really pull out the stops, because, you know, they had caused this huge kind of, I suppose, political atmosphere. I think if you remember, like, at different stages, they get the whole idea of rural crime and the fear people were feeling. And to some extent, I'm not going to say it was overstated, but like, it was quite clear that there were these violent, highly organised gangs that were just pilfering and plundering, like, without anyone seeming to be able to stop them. It would only take a bit of luck every so often. One of them would be caught red-handed, or there'd be, you know, a car crash or something. Something wouldn't work out from one night. But if you consider that when they go on a crime spree, like, they'll do 5 or 6 break-ins in a single night. I think I mentioned that 340,000 in a 10-day spree in this case was mentioned.
From homes?
Mostly from homes, sometimes from commercial premises. But, you know, I mean, they kind of they'd have a feeling, they'd have an instinct into where they're going to get it.
Because if they came into my house, they wouldn't get anything.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Definitely, I'm just announcing that.
They didn't get anything when my house was hit as well.
But, like, seriously, I wouldn't have expensive jewellery. I don't have things, really. But so do they know, or how do they know that people have something worth stealing?
I think they take a punt on it, and they just do so many. Like, you know, I mean, they just break in 5 or 6 houses in a night. You know, if you do that like 5 nights, 7 or 8 nights, or 10 times in a month, you're going to get lucky. And they have done it. There's been, you know, cases where, like, you know, large, you know, 5-figure sum, not 6, but 5-figure sums of money have been taken.
Who would be people
homes.
Who might have a commercial premises or something and have to bring money home. I mean, are they sophisticated enough to sort of be somewhat organised like that, to be watching people in, whatever, garages or at night. Do they take money home still? I'm sure it's smaller companies as well.
Well, we've seen that, like, with even, say, Fat Andy Connor's son, like in the UK, when they were operating, we're putting trackers on cars belonging to, say, the owners of Asian restaurants, and then following them home to see where they live, and then waiting until they went to work and then break in, on the basis that these were people in a cash business who weren't necessarily going to declare their income to revenue. So they were doing a bit of tax collection on their own behalf. And some of these guys we know were operating in Australia as well.
Yeah.
And, we got an insight that time as well. If you remember the case where the Audi Q7 went through a roundabout, and there was the big, that was a huge operation.
Was that members of the Cockwall gang in that car?
No, they were the Connors that time. Yeah. And there would have been a father and his son, and I think a nephew and other relatives. And there's one of those is still, if he does come back to Ireland, will be before the courts, but he was in custody in Australia when these guys were going to court. But again, it gave you an insight into how they work. They were wearing goggles and balaclavas and gloves. They had bleach. They're forensically aware. They're doing their best to make things as hard as possible, like for the guards to catch them. And in this case, they caught them because they crashed their car and nearly got killed. So
the Criminal Assets Bureau case really highlights sort of who's who in it. And they describe Edward as directing the activities of the Cockwall gang along with his brother John. There's two other brothers, there's a Martin and Dan, who we know of, who have criminal convictions as well in relation to this kind of activity. But basically, the Cockwall gang, Cockwall is a way of identifying which branch really of.
Yeah, it's like a kind of any nickname when there's a family name. You get them, like you get them all over Ireland, like in different parts of the country, like as well. But I mean, certainly among some of these kind of crime-based clans in West Dublin, you would have had the Pale Miley Connors and. And the Cockwalls, I mean, they'd be kind of distant, they'd be related to, and they are related. They'd be cousins, certainly. You would have like Mercedes Mickey Wall, also known as Angry Death. I mean, they were kind of, they were kind of, there were nicknames that made them people, know who they are. Like, particularly say, with some of the Rackhill traders, you'd have a lot of nicknames, like, as well. And again, that would be just to identify, exactly who you're speaking about.
Who's who. But the Criminal Assets Bureau are, saying that this Cockwall gang have been operating basically for years. Edward Wall's son, John, was also the target by the Bureau in a similar case. And in that evidence, it was said that he was a member of the grouping and was active in that organised crime group since he was about 10 years of age, which is, still very little shocks you, but like 10 is extraordinary age to be actually listed as a member of an organised crime group.
Yeah, and that came up in other, there's spin-off groups as well, from the Cockwalls, and there was one of them where they kind of mentioned that part of the gang's modus operandi is to kind of bring juveniles, and that, when they get to a certain age, a certain level of capability, like they become full-fledged members. And you're talking about at the age of 14, they possibly reach this kind of, level of maturity. Like some of these kind of spin-off gangs are often led by, fellas that are 21, 22, and they're doing they're copying the template that they've learned. They're doing the same thing. They're probably adding their own bits and pieces to it. The younger generation will come up with new ideas, and different ways of working. So they'll, in a sense, evolve into slightly more efficient machines as they go along.
It was interesting that you mentioned there at the beginning of this discussion that they would have been related to Fat Andy Connors, who of course was based in Saggart and had a property, I think, called The Ranch, along with a few others. But he was actually murdered in 2014 at that property, and nobody to date has been charged in relation to that. There's been one arrest. But actually that whole, Connor's murder and what was going on all around that Saggart area had been on my radar, and was probably one of the first times that I had really properly heard of this Cockwall gang, because it's where those two, the world of that and wealth, supposedly legitimate wealth, collided. And that, of course, was in the story of Jim Mansfield Sr. his building of City West, the development of all the houses out in that area. And of course, he has since passed away, but we have discovered that Mansfield Senior was operating a dirty money business. He was essentially a banker to gangland and had for years been able to keep that fine balance and seemed to have been, put yourself into that world that you need to launder your money. He was a fair broker. I think people were able to put their money through it and bring it back out through properties or whatever deals they were doing with them. But of course, after the crash and he owed so much legitimate money, his whole empire folded and, down the drain went some of those dirty money debts, and they all washed into the sort of the case against him and the fact that he couldn't get his hands on any money. That problem passed on down to his son, Jim Mansfield Jr., as Mansfield Sr. sort of started to get unwell. But all these people were calling, looking for debts they claimed they were owed by Mansfield. And one of the names that was in the mix of that was one of the associates, the members of this Cockwall gang. And I was told at the time that they were calling up to Mansfield's claiming they were owed 4 million, that they had believed that they had invested in some sort of a fisheries project near Britus, where Mansfield Senior had sort of suggested that he was developing this tourist attraction, cottages, and you could fish and do all sorts of these kind of outdoor activities. They believed they were investing in it. The money went wallop with all the rest of the debts, and that the members of the Cockwall gang were terrorising Jim Mansfield Jr., looking for the money back. Now, I think Fat Andy Connors was also claiming that he was owed money out of Mansfield as well. And of course, Mansfield ended up hiring all sorts of illegitimate security to keep him safe. But crazy stories about people sort of rolling around the halls of Tasaggart House, the family mansion, and, demands for money and everything. But it is feasible that the Cockwall grouping would have had enough money to invest that kind of dirty money in Mansfield's operation.
There was no doubt. I mean, Fat Andy was kind of seen, as the fence, really, as in terms of he was the person who would kind of move on the stolen goods and quickly, and that everyone would get their fair share. Like, he had a great reputation for being generous.
Had he? Yeah.
Among I suppose the honour among thieves, as they say. I mean, and he would have had a good reputation. Like, he was genuinely really popular with his relatives who trusted him implicitly.
Yeah. And he also had a really good eye for antiques, for the real deal stuff, didn't he? He knew the value of everything. Yeah,
and not only that, but like he was still at the point where he was a millionaire, still going out with his gloves and his screwdriver and doing the odd recreational burglary himself with his missus. Right. I mean, it's like what you do on a Saturday night.
Yeah.
Like some of us go to the cinema or go for a nice meal, but maybe we'll break into a little posh house somewhere in South County Dublin.
Must be pretty addictive, I'm sure, if you're living in that world and doing that kind of thing. If you're roaming around a house in the dark and you see something on a wall that you realise is worth a hell of a lot of money.
Yeah, we might decide to come back later. We'll get a bigger van, come back on a new day. I'm sure that definitely goes on. I mean, wasn't Martin Cahill famously a creeper as well? He preferred breaking into houses when people were asleep rather than they were empty because he got a bigger kick out of it. So, I mean, there definitely is something to it. Like, I mean, you'd want to enjoy it, to be doing it constantly, throughout your entire life.
So this tax bill will just hang there over his head, Edward Wall. He is due to be released from prison over the coming years.
Yeah, well, he got 4.5 years. It was just last year, and again, that was it was we're just talking about it there. Obviously, the jewellery robbery in Kilkenny. So I mean, he'd be out again, no doubt. He's still relatively young-ish. So,
and what are the chances of the state clawing back their 3 million?
Unlikely, I would imagine. Like, if he doesn't have...
Would a tax bill worry somebody like him?
Not at all.
No, because he's never going to go into legitimate. Yeah. It's only if you wanted to go into legitimate purchasing of properties. Yeah,
well, for some people, it might bother them if they're involved in gangland and they're trying to pretend that they're not. Sending their kids to posh schools and trying to make it look like you're a successful, legitimate business person, and you're not. I don't think there's any element of pretense here. I don't think he gives two hoots whether or not, like, you know, that there's a 3 million bill hanging over him. It does mean every time he's in a car, it's possible it's going to get seized off him, which makes life a little bit difficult. But
and what about that sort of rural crime and those burglaries? I mean, is there, you know, have the Gardaí got a handle on all that now? Are they still out there?
It flares up, like, you know, and every so often. I mean, there's our colleague Ken Foy had a piece recently talking about it, and again, it's a Dublin Kildare-based gang, which is exactly
these really young kids that are doing it and kind of almost doing it out of fun.
No, I think this is. I think Ken was writing about, again, would have been a spin-off from the Cockwalls again, or someone similar. Like, you know, and I mean, even say like the Rubber Rileys, you know, who originally kind of say more Cork and Wexford based, are now in the UK. They were hit by cab, you know, but again around the same time as Edward Wall was as well. And they've been very much kind of moved out of the country. I mean, you can only operate at that kind of intensity for a short period of time now, because the guards will realise that these guys are up and running, and they will pull resources to try and shut them down. Because, I mean, it's such an affront, I suppose, isn't it, to normal society, that if you have a professional gang who seem to have absolutely no fear of the law and no fear of the guards. And
really, the Criminal Assets Bureau doesn't appear to be an arm of the state that is really, because nothing is in the legitimate economy with them. It seems a slightly pointless exercise for, you know, and I think probably the Criminal Assets Bureau have moved on from those tax-based investigations. They don't use them so often anymore. But you have to look at where, again, we spoke about this only recently on a podcast, but what about, it's an OCG, it's a recognised OCG, it's been described as such before the High Court, the Cockwall OCG. What about this, you know, the legislation that's there to target organised crime groups? Has it ever been used in any of these burglary gangs? Directing, you know, the High Court has been told that Edward Wall directed the Cockwall organised crime group, a prolific burglary gang. But there enough criminal...
but that's a civil case. So
it's a civil case,
need the criminal level of proof. So, I mean, to do that, you would need either a witness, which I think you're unlikely going to get in a clan-based kind of criminal gang. You know, families are tight. You're rarely going to get someone to become a state witness in that regard. But you would need phone messages. You need texts. You need phone taps or something. You need some kind of separate evidence to be able to prove it. And I doubt it's there.
Okay. Well, thanks, Eamon.
Always a pleasure, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.